third speaker's the hardest. In my opinion, my experience.
Everyone's allowed their own opinion. No, I just don't like.
There's a correct opinion, which is that the second speech is the hardest.
Okay, we're
The
live.
first speech is the hardest.
We're live. Take it away, Legend
How
Shar.
do we know we're live?
Because it has a little red live button.
Cool. I hope everyone can see the slides. If not, actually, shall I send you the slide link, listener, so you can post it there?
Yeah, I'll edit it on my phone. But from the angle, you can see you and the slides, just only one screen instead of two.
I'll just send it. Well, I'll have to do this here. There you go. Cool. Also, let me know if people are on Zoom asking, or online asking questions. Cool. Welcome everyone. This is going to be a seminar on speaking second at a 3v3 tournament. And as I like to say, it's the hardest speech in debating, and we'll be discussing what makes it so hard and what can you do then to improve and actually be able to make a good second speech. I'm just going to start by explaining what this seminar is not about. This seminar is not about rebuttal. I'm not going to be teaching you how to respond. You have other seminars either done this year, or there are several resources on the University of Auckland Debating Society page videos that have gone through rebuttal before. So this seminar is going to assume that you have a basic understanding of direct responsiveness, about mitigation and weighing, and flipping points. I'm just going to, we can obviously talk about this more if you ask questions at the end of the session, and we can leave enough time for that as well. I'm just going to explain what I mean by these terms so that then when we talk about them in structuring a second speech, it'll make more sense. So direct responsiveness is like the basic rebuttal everyone's probably heard of, is where you say, no, what the other team's saying is not true for these reasons. So you're trying to disprove certain mechanisms, make certain reasons and certain links that the other team has made. Mitigation and weighing is where you say, well, it might be true what the other team is saying, except it doesn't happen to the extent or to the impact that the other side's saying. It's far, far less. So you're mitigating, minimizing the actual impact of the other team's points. Note that it's important that once you do that, you only reduce the importance and the harm that the other side's talking about. That's not enough to win the debate by itself. You also have to weigh that up against something positive that you are contributing in this debate. So you're saying their stuff isn't that important, our stuff is important, and our stuff is more important. So using those comparative words is important. And the last thing I've categorized as flipping. That'll be important later on in this seminar. Flipping is basically where you try to claim something that the other team has claimed, right? You say, this can be done in two ways. An example of one of them is in a debate about this house would prefer that charities did not use like graphic suffering in their advertisement, right, in their marketing. Affirming could say that you don't want to use it because that turns people away. They don't like seeing graphic suffering. It makes them feel uneasy. So they are going to not click on the link. They're not going to actually donate to that charity. Now, on side negative, you could claim the exact same benefit and then mechanistically explain why that reaction is actually the opposite. Maybe graphic suffering makes people feel more empathy towards the people on those ads, and therefore they are more likely to donate. So that's flipping to get the same outcome, flipping it on a mechanistic basis. The second type of flipping that I've identified, note this is very nuanced and complicated. There could be several different things that don't fit into my categories. But the second thing is impact flipping, where when one side affirming, let's say, claims the benefit. An example of this is like one of the world's finals motions, which is that we would prefer not showing the full horrors of war. Side affirming might say, we shouldn't show the full horrors of war, because if we did, the domestic populations of Western countries might not like seeing their soldiers being killed. and therefore not likely to go intervene. So we won't be able to do things like prevent the Rwandan genocide, like something like that in the future. And side negatives can say, we completely agree with your mechanism, we just think your impact is wrong, right? It's actually a good thing that America and the West don't intervene in countries. So for every Rwanda, they're like, it's Afghanistan and Iraq and the examples as to where intervention goes wrong. So that's a different form of flipping. This seminar, though, is not going to be going into more depth about that. This is going to be about putting these pieces together and doing that speech as a second speech. So I haven't prepared many exemplar motions or points. So the audience here will prompt me and ask questions, and maybe we can discuss some examples from your own debating careers and your own experiences. Cool. So what this seminar is specifically about is just dealing with being a second speaker. Being a second speaker is hard. You are often the first response, putting two different cases together. Sometimes those cases don't interact that well. You need to impose your path to victory on the debate. You also don't have much time, right? Because let's say for second affirming, you are the second speech, and unlike the first speaker who can prepare an entire case, you have to react on the spot to what you've just heard, put those things together. And then a third speaker is much more chill, right? You have more time, the arguments are a little more developed, you have time to think and rewrite your structure and rewrite your points of clash. You do not have that luxury at second, so it's going to be about dealing with all of that. Another problem is that there is no clear internal template because it's so, reactionary. You react to the different ways that the other team could make a case. It usually always depends on the debate. Second affirming, because of the lack of time, is usually very different from second negative. And like I said before, even if you did have a template that you were trying to fill in the middle of the debate, you don't often have time to listen, to write their case down, to come up with responses, write those responses down, and at the same time do some structuring. So what I'm going to talk about is what needs to be there at second in order to win a debate. And basically everything that you do in a second speech needs to have a purpose, and you need to know that purpose. Firstly, because that means that you're not wasting time, you're saying something that's important in this debate, but also that you can articulate that purpose to the judge, and that is the meta stuff, just like debating about debating, explaining why this point, why this response actually matters in the grand scheme of the debate and helps you win the debate. So, this is the table of contents for today. We'll be trying to get through this in this hour. We can spend more time on some things, less time on other things, depending on the questions asked by the audience and anyone online. We can spend more time on the relevant sections. So firstly, I'm going to talk about role fulfillment. That's going to set the stage as to what a second speaker is supposed to bring to the debate and inform what we do later on. Secondly, we're going to talk about what we can do during prep. And before your speech is the next one. This is important because, like I said, you do not have much time. So as much of the work you can do beforehand, doing in prep, doing it during other people's speeches, the better. And we'll talk about note-taking a bit there. After that, we'll talk about clashes and rebuttal, basically how to organize everything we've been talking about. Finally, I want to talk about split points, because those of you coming from schools debating probably know that second speakers have a split point. It's slightly different how we think of split points at university, and I'll be giving some tips about that, like it says there, what is even the point of a split point, right? And then finally, questions for everyone. Cool. Firstly, on role fulfillment. Like I just discussed earlier as well, the first speaker's role is relatively simple. It's to set out your stance, mechanize those outcomes, and impact those outcomes. Prove that you get to something from the motion, and then explain why the thing is important and the judge should care about it. And Zach has done a first speaker seminar that I think is pretty good, and I'll be trying to integrate it with that. I think after this is third speakers from Daniel. Replies from Umber, but then after that as well there'll be third speakers from Daniel. Since Zach, Daniel, and I and Umber and I have debated together before, I will try and fit what you do as a second speaker into what Zach's already said, but also what I assume Daniel and Umber are going to say. So, first speakers. Third speakers then activate paths to victory. They say, all right, judge, in your OA, you're going to determine this is a clash, we won that clash, we win the debate, Even if you don't believe that, though, just to extend the margins, here's another reason we win the debate. Here's another reason. Here's another reason. In the words of Zachary Wong, if you don't judge, if you don't give us on either one of these paths of victory, you need to come and explain to us in your OA why we didn't win on either of them, right? The more paths to victory you have, and the better explained each of them are, the more likely you are to win. Now, you as a second speaker, you're stuck in the middle, so what do you actually do? So your role is pretty complicated. You are the actual first response. Like, even if you're negative, first negative has more important things to do. Set out mechanisms, set out impacts. They're a substantive speaker, so second neg is actually the first response, really, when you put the two clashes and cases together. You are also not going to win the debate, right? You are not going, at the end of your debate, your speech, you are not going to be fixing the paths to victory. It's not going to be cleaned up. It's still going to be messy. Your job there is to give the third speaker as much room as possible to do that job, right? Something that I had to deal with, moving from a third speaker to a second speaker, is having a little bit of that trust. Not trying to do everything in my speech. There's not enough time. There's not enough, just not enough time, both before your speech but also during your speech, to respond and wrap things up completely. You need to give that enough room to the third speaker who will do that, trust the third speaker will do their thing. So, briefly, you need to put two different cases together. So you need to start paving your paths to victory. Giving that space that the third speaker can then explain those parts, right? You need to give the room, the foundation for your third speaker. You also want to hit everything. You want to respond to everything the other side says in some manner, because, again, the more you leave behind, the more your third speaker has to do, right? If you miss response to a point, your third speaker will have to respond to that. And that's a waste of time for that third speaker. That third speaker should be putting pieces together to win the debate, not picking up on the fact that you haven't responded to something. Cool. So, we're going to work on this role throughout the debate. Here is a timeline of the debate. Very clearly, it starts prep, before your speech, in your speech, after your speech. And maybe you will be doing replies, so we'll have a section on replies if you are a second speaker that is doing replies. Cool. During prep, are there any questions before we move into the meat of what to do? Based on the purpose, your role, does everyone understand a little bit about what you have to do, what you need to kind of step back and let your third speaker do? I think that's the most important thing I want to drive home, is that you are not going to win the debate, and you let go of that control almost. Cool. So during prep, moving on from what Zach has said in his first speaker seminar, about being preemptive. Similarly, you also should be preemptive. I call it being comparative, right? You will have to deal with putting two different cases together, and you will have to do a bunch of even ifs. Remember, and I'll emphasize this point later on, every even if is a different path to victory, right? We win on this first ground because their characterization is wrong, but even if their characterization is right, in their best case, why do we still win? And so the best thing to do in prep, while other things are going on, your first and third speakers are maybe prepping cases, adding mechanisms, think of the minimal thing that side neg has to stand by, right? Like, you could burden push, you could do a lot of things, but side negative will have something eventually. Very rarely in a debate could you completely shut down a team, disprove everything, and win on every ground, right? Especially if you're up against good teams, and this is a seminar about beating good teams, about doing as well as you can, and that means you have to beat good teams. You will have to make concessions, even if, and try and work through the marginal middle ground cases. So thinking about how you still win, even if side negative gets something, and you have something, all those deadlock breakers, that's another word in terms of like why you, even if both teams prove things, why you still win, is something you should think about in prep. So even when you overclaim at first, you should do those even ifs like I already talked about. And specifically, if you are going to burden push, if you're trying to widen the debate to different contexts, if you're trying to say, hey, side negative, you actually stand by a lot more than you tried to claim at first, you need to mechanize that. You can't just assert those burdens, right? The fact that neg has to do X thing. Think in prep a little bit about why that is the case. Like Zach said in his first speaker seminar, you want to have the seeds of this in your first speech, but the first speaker isn't going to do that, right? It's going to be like, Nick might try to do this, but here's why it's wrong. You get to do that because you're responding to Nick. So even though you have the seeds planted at your first speaker's speech, you should think a little bit more about that in prep because you're going to be doing it. You should also discuss potential even ifs and concessions because at some point you will have to mitigate, right? Like if there was a motion where you could completely disprove a harm from the other side, it's not a good motion and the EdgeCo should not set that motion, right? Every single debate we have has two sides to it to make it fair for both sides, which means eventually you will be mitigating instead of directly disproving something, and eventually you will have to do some weighing and stuff like that. So at some point you need to be like, all right, even if they get this benefit, why do we still win? And discussing that with your other teammates kind of helps you form a strategy, make sure you don't do things that your speakers will be mad about, talk to your speakers of your team about that. In prep as well, you should be responding to your own case, right? So you should be looking for holes and thinking about how you can bridge those gaps, bring those mechanisms together. Like I said before, deadlock breakers. If charity doing showing graphic suffering has two things that happens. Sometimes it makes people disgusted, sometimes it creates empathy. You can see those mechanisms are likely to act on an everyday person. You should be thinking in prep. You should know, okay, a good NAIC team will bring these arguments out. How do we merge the two? How do we prove that one is either more impactful on individuals or applies slightly before? Maybe to get the empathy, you need to actually go click and read more, but the initial reaction of graphic suffering means people don't go through. All of those ways of breaking that deadlock, things you should be thinking about in prep. Any questions about prep stuff? No? Cool. Any questions you still have as well and you think about later, there'll be a question thing at the end, but you can ask questions over the entire seminar. All right, before your speech. So prep's happened. You've said your introductions in the room. First speakers got up to start speaking. What do? Important thing to do is to listen to both first speeches. Now, I want to make a small point here in terms of getting better at second. You can't do everything perfectly at second. It's such a weird speech to do because I think it's almost impossible to perfect it. You have to do a lot, right? So you have to listen to their speech and to come up with responses. As you listen, you need to structure all those responses into a structure. The way you do that is by developing like a muscle memory almost, right? So sometimes, some speakers, at least me, I focus on writing the speech down as clearly as I can and writing responses. I create the structure as I speak, right? So I've gotten good at creating a structure, enforcing the structure of my speech while I speak. So I don't spend time restructuring before my speech. Other people do it the other way. They spend time restructuring and writing down everything the other team says, and they come up with responses on the fly. So they have a prompt that says, oh, this point that they made, here are responses, and they're pretty good debaters, so they come up with responses on the fly. It's up to you to find out what vibes with you, and those other things of coming up with things, either structure or responses on the fly, are just things you have to develop by doing a lot of practice. This is why second is hard. Cool. Listen to your first. So this is about what you should do while listening to first speakers. Listen to your first, but also listen with the judge's ear, right? Because in prep, when you're so convinced about your own case and you're like, wow, that's a cool mechanism, you are kind of blinded, right? Because you are trying to push a case forward. When you listen to someone else deliver that, then you'll be able to see the holes a little bit more obviously. So you can be like, oh, does this sound sufficiently proven? This is kind of iffy. Have you sufficiently mechanized it? Highlight that, because that is a point of attack for the other team. So you can already start fixing those holes even before the response by the other side is made, right? All these things help you save time. If you're doing that active work and not just sitting back and relaxing during your first speaker speech, that's less time. You need to panically do that in your own speech or while the other team is speaking. Similarly, for examples, your first speaker has a lot to do. They might not explain a mechanism, they might not explain an example that well. That's also something to highlight. Okay, I might need to re-explain this example in a particular way, and you can write that down, leave space in how you're going to do that structure yourself. When you listen to their first, that's important, right? You're going to end up responding to that case, you're going to end up responding to that team's points. So be charitable. So there's no point responding to the worst form of that argument. There's no point responding to like the dumbest points that they brought out, because there's a second and a third speaker after you from the other team, which means they'll just fix it down the line. So you're wasting your time if you respond to the worst form of that point. You want to make that point as broadly well as possible, which also means that you kind of save a little time. Because now you don't need to worry about the nitty-gritty detail of mechanisms as much if you are going to make the best form of that argument and then tear it down, right? Obviously, this relies on you being able to respond to that best form, but obviously, work on that as you do debating. Try and be as charitable as possible and respond to the best form of their points. Cool. Just a small point about note-taking. Like I said during the speech, just before there's a lot to do. You listen, you write responses, you need to fix all the new things that have happened into your structure. During your first speaker speech, while you're listening and writing, thinking of the holes, thinking about where responses could come, you can do some structuring. There's not many responses you have to create, right? So that's what you do during your first speaker speech. If you're second affirming, this is where the difference happens. Second affirming, you literally have no time. You either make responses or structure up on the fly, up to you and how you allocate those things based on your own skills, right? If you're second neg, you have slightly more time, right? So during your first affirming speech, you write down their case, you write responses, you're like, all right, so this is what they're going to say. Then you have your team's first speaker, first neg. Now you can chill a bit, do the listening, okay, are the holes there, those kinds of things, but you do have more time, so you can start restructuring, maybe writing some clash points out now itself, some questions that you're going to divide your speech up into. Leave as much space as possible, because second affirming is going to come up and you need to join those responses, those material with the structure you've already got. So you can either leave space in your papers to write stuff in there, if that's the way you do it, or another way of doing it is using piles. So you have separate pieces of paper with different responses and points that you pile together in a certain order just before you get up to speak, and then you speak through that, right? Obviously, these things require different skills in terms of putting that structure together, and you should find something that works for you. I did a lot of pile work when I was third speaker. At second, I personally do something slightly different, where I have like two pieces of paper, one with responses, one with my case, and I merge the two in my head as I speak. And maybe you have some like superficial arrows that point around. It's confusing, but again, to each their own. You just need to be aware that you need to control that structure, and we'll talk about that in a bit. All right, any questions about what we do before your speech itself and how you can make the most of the time that you have before you're thrown into the mix and now you have to create a speech on the fly, basically? No questions? Cool. All right, so this is going to be about putting that structure together. How do you fix your clashes? How do you put in the rebuttal, your mitigation, your flipping, etc. All right, so putting the cases together, you need to impose some strategy now. The fully formed strategy, the fully formed paths to victory will come out at third, and your reply will explain how that actually worked out. So you just need to sow the seeds there. So you need to impose structure onto the debate, which is the kind of same thing you do to impose structure on your own speech. So the best way I've found to impose structure and strategy on my speech and subsequently on the whole debate is through my introduction, right? So I just first say that I think out of all the different speeches, the introduction at second is really important, because the rest of your speech might divulge into chaos, right? And your introduction just sets up the judge to be like, all right, even though it got chaotic, I still knew what you were trying to achieve. But also, because either you're putting it together at second affirming, or remember, you're not doing this alone. There's another speaker against you that's going to do the same thing, right? Against good teams, they'll be doing all this as well. So if you're second negative, you actually need to impose your strategy over their one. You don't want to get sucked into their paths to victory, because that obviously is what's best for them, right? Sometimes it merges perfectly well together, and that's pretty easy, but sometimes it doesn't. So introduction. has led me in my career as a second speaker at Australs, especially at some pre-Australs. You can ask Zach or Daniel. I've had like really long intros, like a 3-minute, 4-minute intro that I was, probably not a good thing, but I think it was the process, right? Like I had to use the intro to make sense of my speech, and after a while, I got good at shortening that intro down, writing a little bit more specifically, and then distributing that meta later on. And so maybe that's a process you need to go through. I would also suggest you focus on that introduction. What I use the introduction for then is to quickly explain how I'm merging those cases together and how I'm going to create the paths to victory. And what I use in the words I use to force myself to do that is I connect my introduction to my signposting. And that is, introduction happens, and then I have 3 points for you, Judicator, 1, 2, 3. The way I connect it is I use the words, it follows that, right? So what that clearly means is that if I've done my introduction properly, it should be so obviously adjudicated that my clashes are going to be X, Y, and Z, right? And what that means is usually you have your clashes, then you need to formulate your introduction to match those clashes. And then impose a structure on yourself, impose a structure, and make sure the judge knows why you're doing all the clashes that you're about to do. All right, so everything in clashes, integrate, 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 right? So you can create those clash points by asking questions. I'll have an example of that later on soon. Even ifs, remember, are different worlds and different concessions. This first clash is about this characterization. If you win this characterization, all the harms that, they only responded through characterization that my first speaker brought to you stands. Here's why the characterization is true. Therefore, points stand, we win. Even if that characterization is kind of true, a different world, different alternative the judge might buy into, we still win for X, Y, Z reasons, right? Remember, giving your third as much room as possible. If they refuse to engage with the characterization, third is a much easier job pushing margins. If they do, doesn't matter, your third has that even if that they can fall back on if you've completely lost the other point. Giving your third as much pieces to play with, that's the name of the game at second. All right, with that then, the only extraneous rebuttal that's not within a clash, not within those questions you're asking, should be for the absolutely dumb stuff, right? The stuff that you thought was not important to have any meta associated with it. So don't justify it, don't legitimize it by having meta. Again, this is a strategic call you're making, right? It depends on how good you are at thinking whether something is so dumb and isn't relevant to the broader winning of a debate. And even then, you want to do micro-response. Like, before I get into my clashes, this dumb point, don't say that, but this point that I think is not relevant at all, that's not relevant for A, B, C, D. Done. Move on. Right? Because that's not as important. You want to just deal with it. You want to hit everything, but you want to quickly move on to the more important stuff. Right. So, remember I said each of those clashes are points. You're creating paths to victory. You're paving the way for your third speaker. Some tips on how to come to those, to that path basically. The one I use, and there might be others. You should talk to other second speakers, watch their debates, watch their style, watch their structure, and you'll find something that fits your own style and your own way of thinking. I like to start with what do both teams agree on, right? Here's where you can make some strategic concessions. In the charity debate, both teams care about getting more charity. We agree. Whoever gets more donations wins this debate. We just disagree, and then the next thing is obviously, where do we disagree? We disagree on how that happens. So I'm going to explain to you my first clash point, how we get more donations, and then other things in the debate. So, for example, that first example there, you both want the same outcome, what I just described. You just have a disagreement in the mechanisms that take you there. So you want to do some comparative mechanism and rebuttal in that point. Note there, and this is the trick to integrating, the distinction between rebuttal and substantive points is not really real, right? Like, it's all pushing you towards winning the debate. So when you're responding to their idea of graphic suffering scares people, and you're running the empathy line, those are two things that you need to discuss, right? Sure, you're responding to them because they said it first, but you can put those two things together and explain why your perception, your idea of how people react to that material is more true and more relevant and more likely to happen. Cool. Some other examples, you might agree on the same mechanism. Mechanism's correct, but it has like a trade-off, right? Raising the minimum wage means you pay more people. That's a guarantee on F. People get paid more. Argument on neg is that results in fewer people being hired. So benefit that's almost guaranteed and a harm that's almost guaranteed. That's what we agree on. We agree this neg results in these things, and there might be some fights on how much and all that stuff you can do in one clash. But then eventually you disagree on the harms to different groups, and you need to do the weighing, mitigation, and all that stuff. If the characterization changes those things, like how the mechanisms play out, the impacts play out, deal with that first. Impact your best world. Like I said, we win the characterization, here's why we win the debate, impacting it. Even if they're our best case, why do we still win, right? And here's an example of that. The motion was, it's motion from 2020's Australs Octafinals, that we should stop the practice of requiring communities' approval to build houses of worship. I'll explain this in a bit. So that we should stop the practice of requiring communities' approval to build houses of worship. We were assigned negative. So we were saying that the community of different areas should be required to give approval when some other group, some group within that community wants to build a house of worship. Now, side affirming. I'm going to describe their case, and then I'm going to describe how I responded to that. This speech is online. I don't think it's a particularly good speech. But remember, the point isn't the way I made the arguments in the rebuttal, but the structure and why I chose that structure. Okay. The first thing that they said at some point was, well, this is good because this is nudge theory, right? Like, the reason why, if you ask someone directly, do you want a mosque to be built, they might say no because you made them think about it. But now that they don't think about it, they're not actually upset about it. That's the point that was made by side affirming. Then they were like, okay, but this is really important for immigrant communities, right? The immigrant communities would not be able to have the houses of worship, not have those community structures. That's bad. We shouldn't let racist majority communities control the access to houses of worship. In our first speech, first neg, Zach, we made the case. Zach came up and said, hey, this context isn't just immigrant communities. This context is Kashmir, where state-led Hindu nationalism builds temples in Muslim majority areas like Kashmir in order to strike fear in people's hearts, to dilute their culture, that kind of thing. Those people are the most vulnerable in those contexts. The Kashmiri people, the Muslims that are persecuted, they should have control over what goes on in their community. So we're expanding and adding context. So what I did in my speech in second neg, extraneous rebuttal. That nudge theory point, really dumb. In fact, we can co-opt that because we don't need to say always ask them, right? Like the normal way the planning committees work is that a notification is put up. People who are extra interested in that can go lodge a complaint and shut it down. Otherwise, it just goes through. So nudge theory is on our side. On your side, you actively don't give them a choice. That is important for a mechanism we have later on. First, path to victory, proving our context matters. I explained why their failure to deal with the Kashmiri example and other examples that I added on, very bad for them because those are far more vulnerable people than immigrants to a particular country. Impacted that, we should win on that alone adjudicator. Even if this debate was more about their context, we are making a claim that it's worse for those communities because of backlash, right? Like you impose something on them, you take away their control, and that buys into narratives of xenophobia and loss of control and cultural degradation of their country, those kinds of things. And so what I'm doing there is I'm first going to mitigate their unique benefit. They want to say, oh, the houses of worship is so important, that creates community, it creates spirituality. I'm like, no. To get community, you can just do other things, right? That isn't a house of worship that is like culturally exaggerated, pushed in people's faces, big landmark change. You could have community activities. You can have like a national community day, in New Zealand, Sri Lankans can get together and play cricket or something like that. So you can have those community bonds and support structures without house of worship. Spirituality, you don't need a house of worship. In fact, what you can do is have things at home, right? Where priests go door to door and give you spirituality. Obviously, not as much, not community spiritual, but it's not that bad, right? So I'm mitigating their benefit. It's bad. It's worse than having that house of worship, but it's not that bad. It's not as exaggerated as they wanted to say. Then rebuild my case, which is that we have backlash coming up, all the stuff I said, impact that harm. That's far more important than spiritual community, right? If this results in like hate crimes towards you, if this results in bad government policy like redlining you, economic harm that segregates your community because people are now annoyed that you took away their control over their neighborhood, that's far worse. So mitigation, rebuilding my mechanism, impacting, weighing the two things. You see how each of those things gives my third speaker, in that case Daniel, the scope to win on many different levels and push the margins and all the things that Daniel will talk about eventually. Right, any questions? No? Aish, are there questions online?
No, I've been looking. There's
cool.
not any.
Cool, all right. So, final thing to talk about. We'll do a little bit on replies, but that's not as important. Are split points. So, as to be straight, you don't need a split point. No one in university expects second speaker to have a split point. If that point by itself was important enough to win the debate, it really should have been at first, right? So, like, split points as a completely new concept, as a completely new direction in the debate, not as useful, because it should, if it's important enough, it should be at first. But what happens then is what you're doing is you're either expanding and extending on certain points, impacting them in a slightly different way. That can count as a split point. The ideal split point should be preemptive or a mitigation. Something you thought about in prep, you're like, Nick could say this. How can we claim a little bit of that as well, right? How can we claim that it's better on our side, and we can try and flip it completely, or just mitigate the difference between the teams in my split point? And then merge as well with the clashes, because then your split point becomes just another, it follows then that after doing that, I will explain why they don't get this small benefit, and that becomes a split point. What I like to do after getting relatively good at coming up with stuff, I think BP really helps with that, because if you're a member in British Parliamentary, you kind of need to come up with a new point and new framing on the spot. So you can just react. Take a clash, phrase it positively. Remember the dichotomy of substantive and rebuttal? Doesn't make sense. Just phrase it the other way around, substantive positive point for your side, right? Example of that, same debate. After all those clashes, another point that the affirming team made was contact theory. That actually having houses of worship is good, because then people can see the culture, the majority, right? They can see that culture, they can see the contact between them and the immigrant community, and slowly become less racist, less xenophobic, all that stuff. Basically contact theory, right? And so in that debate, after I did all the clash stuff, I had a split point about how we get contact theory better. So trying to flip it and directly take that benefit away from them, but I phrased it as a positive new point that I'm bringing out, right? So I said, I built it on the spot, and I was like, well, contact theory actually happens when people just meet each other at work, right? These people, yes, are in the community. They will have shops. They will work in shops. They will work in businesses. They will meet the majority people. Everyday interaction. That's how contact theory works. Note, that's not enough. You need to always prove that they stop that benefit, right? So I'm going to break the mutual exclusivity of their contact point, say, no, it happens anyway. In fact, like I mentioned before, you taking away this control, erecting huge monuments that are culturally exaggerated and don't fit in with the surrounding landscape that people directly see, results in bad contact theory, right? We also made a point about how the part of the backlash would be like defacing the houses of worship. And the point there is then, what's the message, right? If you're a majority person and you see like a foreign house of worship that has been vandalized, you're not going to think, oh, that's a good place, right? So a lot of stuff like that, I took from my responses that I'd written, created a split point, created a positive material about how not only do we protect them from backlash, we actually promote contact theory for the long term, flipping their stuff. So that's ideally what you do with a split point. Ideally, the best thing you can do to actually add value in the debate with a split point. Cool. Last thing to discuss is what you do after your speech. I think this is important, right? Because, sure, you're a second speaker, you paved the way. Like I said, trust your third, but that doesn't mean that you leave your team, right? Like your first speaker is still involved, your first speaker is still adding, listening, passing material down. So you should POI, and specifically on the responses you've made. Especially, and this is another debating terminology, especially if they're upstream of new points and impacting. So let's say in the debate I just talked about in like spirituality, let's say the contact theory point, right? The speaker after me goes and says, hey, well, we get contact theory. And then they start impacting the benefits of bridging between cultures, spending a lot of time impacting that. You have responded to that. So your POI should be, hey, I responded to that. Why does that actually not happen more on our side? Force them to deal with the responses, but also point out, not just in POIs, but to your third speaker, point out where they are misunderstanding or deliberately strawmanning at some points, the points that you've made, right? Because you know those points, you know how you've said them. Hopefully you are critical of yourself. And so you should be like, okay, so this is not exactly what I said. Or you should be critical and be like, what I said wasn't that clear. Can you just clear this up? This is what I meant. Help your third speaker, because they're also doing a lot of work at third. Listen hard and pass material down. If you are doing reply as a second speaker, it's important to listen to the rest of the debate, because like we said, you aren't winning the debate. You've just paved the way for your third speaker to move pieces around, make strategic choices, and react to what the other team's doing. So the debate continuously changes after your speech. In your reply, you want to give a holistic idea of how you won, not just assume that everything that happened after your speech didn't happen, right? So you do, if you're doing reply, need to listen, need to engage, need to track the debate. Cool. Any questions? Yes, James.
What's your opinion on using reply as a second to milk scores?
Reply as a second to milk scores. What does that mean?
It doesn't work.
No.
You'll in fact tank your reply score, which is pretty sucky.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. We can talk more about that later.
So, what about giving a really unstructured speech, like the one I gave once, right? And then your opponents would find it really difficult to respond to it. But my points would still be understandable to the judges, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's actually a really important thing to discuss, both in terms of why it is good to be as structured as possible, and then secondly, how do you actually respond to an unstructured speaker, right? So the first thing to be structured as possible is that you want to give the judge the path of least resistance, right? And the more structured you are, and the more handholdy you are with the judge, taking them through each point very nicely and explaining it, the more likely they are to believe in that flow of logic and that world. And even if the other team doesn't respond, obviously sometimes teams are bad and you win because everything you said stands. The judge actively tries to not do too much work for you. So if you haven't made the point clearly, the judge is like, did they really make the point that well? Am I doing too much for them? And the judge second guesses. In terms of responding to unstructured speakers, it's very hard because, again, as a second speaker, you want to hit everything. You want to impose structure. If the other person is chaotic and unstructured, it's so hard to do that. But again, be charitable. Try and understand where they're coming from. Because again, the third speaker will fix it, and your speech will be useless if you haven't done as much as you can to win it there. I've judged many a debate where the first speaker has been relatively unclear and chaotic. No one has responded to it well, and then the last speaker has come up and just been like, here's what we said, and I'm like, as a judge, I'm just like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense now. Other team hasn't responded to that. That point still stands, and that team tends to win. And so being charitable, making sure that you are responding to the best possible version of that point is A, good for you in getting your speaks up, but B, good for your team in actually being more likely to win the debate. Again, the less work your third has to do, the more able they are to win the debate. Think of yourself as like doing as much of the heavy lifting as possible so your third can win the debate. Yeah, James.
What's your advice to coming up with good clashes at second F, like based on the first neg speech?
Yes, so, no, it's good, it's good. So the first thing you do is you ask questions. What you're trying to do is trying to create paths to victory, right? And integrate everything together. So you're kind of making baby paths to victory. So the trick I use sometimes is to ask, where do we agree? Where do we disagree? And by your second F now, you know your case. First F is spoken. Second neg just spoken as well. And even at the start, like the first 3 minutes, if they're good, if they're chaotic as well, you should try and like eke out what they're trying to say. They should tell you basically what their path to victory is. What are they focusing on? Is it mechanistically, or is it a different stakeholder group that they're impacting? Those kinds of things. So, what do we agree on? In your speech, you say, let's talk what we agree on. We agree on this. Cool? Everyone's cool. What do we disagree? And that should lead you to your clashes. So, if it's the same outcome, but there's a disagreement of who gets that outcome, your clashes, which mechanism actually gets that outcome. If it's the same mechanism, and that mechanism has a trade-off, discuss that trade-off, explain why there's a harm, explain why there's a benefit, try and minimize the harm that's going to happen, try and maximize the benefit on your side, and then finally weigh the two harms together, right, or the groups together. And again, the only way you can actually get good at this is by practice. Second is chaotic. You actually have to be put in that situation to be able to create that structure from scratch on the fly. So what I was saying, James, earlier is that as far as I see, there are like 2 ways to approach, because you have to do a lot. You listen, write responses, make a structure. Sometimes you aren't able to do all of them well. Sometimes you do some of them on the spot. So what I do is I usually listen very carefully, write a lot of responses. I don't always say all of my responses, I just write them out. And then I create the structure on the spot as I speak. Right? Another thing you could do, I'm not sure whether this works or not, this is just the alternative, is that you listen very carefully, you write everything down in a structure, and then you come up with responses on the spot. Right? But yeah, so either way, you're kind of generating that muscle memory of being able to structure. These kinds of questions help. So just to redo that for you, one thing I used to do is have an introduction and be like, make sure the line, it follows that, leads into my signposting. So my introduction is still in the strategy. If I've done that introduction properly, then it should be very obvious that these 3 things are going to be my clashes. So trying to match those 2 things together will help you be better each time you do it in having a proper structure. Yes, Melissa.
In prep, how do you balance the trying to suck up all of the information you can get about the strategy of the case and helping out your first and third with getting that case together in a way that you think will win? I
mean, sorry, it depends on your team and who is generating ideas, who is generating strategy, those kinds of things. So I only know what it's obviously practicing with your team before Australs, before any tournament is very, very useful. Practicing with a team is, I think, far more useful than practicing just by yourself or with another team. With me, Zach, and Daniel, what would happen is we would all discuss, do brainstorm, 5 minutes, discuss very quickly. We got very efficient at discussing, coming up with the comparative and framework, things that Daniel will talk about, I think, in his session, because he loves talking about those things. And then we'll agree, like, okay, this is how we're going to do this. And in that one, in that team, actually, Daniel drove a lot of the mechanisms and structuring and stuff. And some of it was just like downloaded onto Zach. Zach would be writing it, framing things out. So the first speaker, as Zach says, does a lot in framing and structuring stuff, where there's a continuous stream of points that Daniel's making. I, at most of those points, sat and thought about what the other team's going to say. And be like, hold on, what if they say this? Right? And Daniel would be like, oh, yeah, we'll get to that, and then think about that. Maybe at some point, Zach's still writing stuff down, so Zach takes a break to finish writing a train of thought, Daniel turns to me, he's like, oh yeah, about that, what do we do? And then we discuss that a little bit, go back. Maybe then we're like, oh, sorry, Zach, remember that model? We're just going to add something there. We're going to cut something out because there could be a potential problem. So we're continuously revisiting certain things, adding mechs and stuff like that. And sometimes, sometimes I'm asking too many questions, and then Zach's like, shut up. And I'm like, cool, you tell me when you're ready, and we'll come back to this. Sometimes I don't get that question answered. And then in the debate, that happens, and then I have to, answer it myself. I don't get confirmation from my teammate because there's not enough time, and then I make that point, right? And remember, things that you do as second, you want to try as much as possible to give your third the least amount of work to do, but also sometimes you have a third, right? So like, it's not the end of the world. You have a little bit more security as long as you trust your third speaker. So coming back to the idea of trust, I think my speeches and the way I felt about my speeches at Australs in 2020 was very nice because Daniel is an exceptional third speaker. So it was like, I can kind of get away with screwing things up because Daniel's coming up after me. So it kind of gives you a little bit more room yourself to be a little bit more liberal with your long introductions, a little bit more liberal with the way you want to win the debate and make those paths to victory for Daniel. Cool. Yes, Melissa.
Do you have any specific tips on how you can practice, especially when you're going second affirming, downloading information from speakers that are speaking at the same time being able to like understand what the response to it is?
I mean, I don't think there are any specific drills and stuff besides doing that debate, right? Second affirming, I think, is the hardest position. Like I said, the least amount of time. Second neg, broadly, is very similar to a third. You have enough time to write those clashes out, restructure. So the trick I'll say is for every single pre-Australs and practice run-up that I do, I ask to do F. You do some neg practice because you kind of want to get the vibes of neg, but F practice as much as possible. Right? It's the hardest side to be on. Hardest thing to do second F, and the most practice on that, the better. It makes you much faster. In terms of getting better at listening and writing responses, it's all about processing speed. Firstly, processing speed and understanding what they're going to say, because you hear a couple of lines that, okay, I know that point, basically. The best version of that point, let me think of some responses, let me think about how that interacts. That just comes with practice. So as the processing speed gets better, you get better. I would say the natural path for speakers is to start off at third and then become a second, because you're doing the similar kinds of things. You're just doing it faster and faster and faster and faster, right? And so I went from a third that was able to become a second. Sorry, George, you had a question.
Yeah, so one of the hardest things I find about being third speaker, and to a certain extent second speaker as well, is that I keep getting new ideas, new responses, new ideas getting whispered at by my two teammates, right? And as a result, the structure just gets really messy because I keep putting new ideas down, and it's really hard to talk about.
Well, I think that is just a generic problem because like, let's say your second affirming, it is new ideas that are coming from not just from your teammate but from the other speaker that's speaking, right? Yeah. And so. That is all I'm saying is you practice being able to listen and write and structure on the spot. That's all stuff you will improve. In terms of individually how you feel on a bench, at some point, especially, obviously it's practice, maybe it's worth trying to do that. Maybe it's worth trying to cram in new stuff and practice imposing that structure. Practice imposing your own structure, knowing how things fit together, practicing all that. If it's like, relatively serious and you're getting overwhelmed, you have complete control over your speech, and you're actually completely free to be like, sorry guys, there's too much talking right now, I need to focus on creating the structure, right? I've been a third speaker that said that before, I've been said that by many third speakers before, so it's like, obviously while you practice with teams, so you kind of gotta get used to that communication. I think Asia's A1 team for joint had a post-it note system instead of speaking system. They would like put in work orders, like say this, and then at some point when they're feeling more free, they'll read that and be like, okay, I'm gonna put that in there. So you work your own way out when you have a team that you're practicing with for a long time. If it's a random team, then it's more up to you to be like, sorry guys, I just need more time, calm down. And it's fine if you lose out some responses. Sorry, one more thing I want to make is that especially second, I think it's worth a second. You're doing all these different skills: listening, structuring, writing responses. And to get good at each one of them, you need to invest time practicing that, which means that you let go of some of the others. So let's say I spend more time listening, trying to work on my listening skills. I don't write as many responses. I don't spend much time on structure. My speech gets worse, right? So debating happens in the J curve of improvement. You have to get worse for a marginal amount first before you get better. And so sometimes you need to do that. Like, all right, I'm not going to write any responses. I'm just going to work on structuring. Or the other way around. I'm not going to work on structuring. I'm going to write in responses. So I think I'm personally weak at coming up with responses. So I'm going to spend more time in the debate doing that. My speeches suffer because there's no structure. It's a stream of consciousness, response, response, response. But after a while, you get good at responses so much that it kind of becomes a little bit subconscious. It becomes a little bit muscle memory. And then you can allocate your processing speed and your mental resources on doing something else. So that's part of the ability of getting better at anything in debating, anything in life really, but specifically for a second speaker. It's kind of a trade-off you have to make. Don't worry about doing worse speeches in the name of improving overall in the future. You let go of your personal, ego in that speech and experiment, try new things, and it'll always pay out if you continue with it. Cool, that seems to be it. Where's the thank you screen? Thank you. Cool.
So true.
You're welcome.
Unless there are more questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shar. That was so insightful, and thank you for giving me some tools to navigate the hardest position in debating. I feel more comfortable now.
Sound stuff.